Of course, in Lockhart's defense against the dark arts class, he had a knack for transfiguration. Most of the time, he simply changed the covers of other people's textbooks into ones that bore his name. With Lockhart's dubious magic, there wasn't much risk of being caught. Ron had a new wand this year. Because he hadn't smashed into the Homping Willow and broken it, his spell work had improved noticeably. Even Ron could feel the difference. Where his old wand had offered a faint, annoying resistance, the new one made casting smooth and natural. Professors had taken to praising him, and that praise only boosted his confidence and performance further. Things were finally moving in a good direction. "By the way, Ed, why did you ask me to come over?" Ron asked, curious. Usually he and Harry or Hermione sought Ed out. It was rare for Ed to come to them, and rarer still that he had singled out Ron. Ed smiled. "I need a favor, and it would be great if your twin brothers were willing to help too." He reached into his pocket and produced a stack of silvery cards. Ron picked one up and found a chibi-style unicorn illustrated on the face. He turned it over, puzzled. "What is this?" Harry and Hermione, who had drifted over with Ron, craned their necks to see the cards. They were inseparable from Ron enough that they couldn't resist being part of whatever Ed had pulled them into. "These are some alchemical items I've been making. Call them destiny cards," Ed explained. "This is just the first version. I'll improve them later. Try channeling a little magic into the pattern I engraved on the card, follow the runes, and see what happens." Ron and Harry obeyed out of curiosity. They put a little of their magic into the cards, and a faint glow ran across the silver surfaces. Almost instantly, the cards disappeared from their hands, and, to the astonishment of everyone nearby, a small unicorn no bigger than a calf appeared in each boy's arms, adorable and wrapped in a silvery shimmer. "This is," they all blurted. Heads turned at other tables. A few students peered over, then gasped when they saw the little unicorns cradled by the three of them. Ed beamed at the reaction, clearly pleased, but the other students kept their distance. Ed had invited Ron, Harry, and Hermione, not the whole room. Harry stroked the unicorn in his arms. Its coat was impossibly smooth and gleamed with a flowing silver light. Just holding it gave him a warm, reassuring calm. "How did you do this?" he asked. "It's complicated," Ed said. "It draws on ritual magic, transfiguration, charms, alchemy, and even a component of the Patronus charm." The trio had only asked casually, but Ed's answer was dense enough to make their heads spin. They knew this wasn't something they could replicate easily. For now, the unicorns summoned by the cards are meant to be pets. They don't have offensive power. That said, because each card contains a fragment of Patronus energy, and because of the unicorn's own nature, they can help against dark influences, calming and repelling certain dark effects. He grinned. Making them more powerful or more aggressive is the next step. These are just first editions. Hermione reached for another card on the table. The front showed a unicorn with the title Holy Light Unicorn and the number 08 in the lower right corner. At the very bottom, almost as an aside, was an engraved Ravenclaw motto, "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." On the back, an ornate pattern formed the shape of a raven, and beneath it was a proverb, "Time flows like water, wisdom grows with each passing day." The number 008 appeared again. "What's the number?" Hermione asked. "Oh, Holy Light Unicorn. And 008 just means it's the 8th one I've made," Ed said, smiling. These cards were replicas he'd produced by combining ritual magic and alchemy, and they were linked to an original prototype. He'd spent months perfecting the ritual and finally produced this set. It was his biggest breakthrough in recent weeks. The original main card for the Holy Light Unicorn series was the Control Unit. When he modified or strengthened that main card, the subordinate cards would update accordingly in real time. It was his plan for future mass production. Of course, that wasn't the whole story. Many of Ed's current schemes were still just ideas, plans that had to be realized step by step. Right now, his biggest goal in making these cards was simply to earn some extra money from the younger students at Hogwarts. Alchemy and ritual magic were expensive pursuits. A single failed experiment could drain dozens of galleons. Ed casually handed a small stack of cards to Hermione and Harry, then smiled. "These 3 cards are a gift from me. You can summon a unicorn with them during this period. If anyone asks, Just tell them what's going on. It was subtle advertising. If there was one student at the school who drew attention like no other, it was the famous Harry Potter. Harry looked down at the miniature unicorn cradled in his hands and then up again. Already many eyes in the great hall were fixed on them, and low whispers spread through the tables. "Ed, what are you trying to do?" someone murmured. Harry scratched his head. He didn't mind helping. He liked the little unicorn, and helping Ed out with this was no trouble. Being the center of attention wasn't his favorite thing, but he'd long since gotten used to it. "Because I'm short on money, of course," Ed answered with an exaggerated sigh. "You have any idea how expensive alchemy is?" he went on. "Never mind. If I told you, you still wouldn't understand." They did understand, though, at least enough. Ever since the previous year, when they'd learned that one of Ed's potions cost him 3,000 galleons to make and sold for over 6,000, Harry and the others had suspected he was working on something costly. It now seemed the cards were part of his current research. Hermione piped up. "So that's why you haven't been in the library every night? You've been tinkering on your own? Were you doing this last year too, when you said you couldn't tell us what you were doing?" Ed nodded. He had been working on the monster book last year, and the destiny cards were a key piece of that project, so she wasn't wrong. Then he pulled 10 identical cards from his collection, split them into 3 piles, and handed portions to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "I'll be relying on you to help me with this," he said. "The price is temporarily set at 5 galleons. If any Gryffindor students want one and are willing to buy," he smiled. "Of course, I won't make you work for nothing. For every card you sell for me, I'll give you 1 sickle. Sell 10, and I'll round it up to a full galleon for you." 1 galleon equaled 17 sickles. Ed meant that if someone sold 10 cards, earning 10 sickles in commission, he'd top them up to a full galleon. Harry and Hermione barely reacted, but Ron, always short on money, brightened immediately. Last year, Ed had given Ron over 30 galleons, and Ron had squandered most of it on books and new wands for himself and Ginny. He was flat broke now. The little reward Ed offered seemed very attractive. Ron hesitated. "But will it sell? 5 galleons isn't cheap." Ed waved a hand. "Don't worry, it's fine if it doesn't sell." To first years, 5 galleons was a lot. To older students, it was manageable if they really wanted something. There would always be a few who loved cute, magical creatures enough to pay for an experience like this. After all, ordinary witches and wizards rarely had a chance to touch a unicorn, even a summoned, miniature one. Ed himself knew how difficult it was to get close to a unicorn. Freya still held a grudge when he tried to touch her, and his usual head-patting trick hadn't worked. This summoned unicorn was also mildly resistant to dark arts, making it effectively a weakened magic item. Pricing it at 5 galleons was, among classmates, a reasonable deal. "Make sure you write down who you sell to," Ed added. "For now, each customer can only buy 1. He looked at the 3 of them. "What do you think? Alchemy is costly. These cards aren't cheap to produce." They weren't wrong. Each card cost Ed about 2 galleons to make, and with his knowledge and craftsmanship, no other witch or wizard could replicate them, not when the design came from a genuine destiny card. If he were selling outside Hogwarts, he wouldn't consider anything under 50 galleons. But here, among students, he was aiming to build a reputation and make the cards accessible. "All right," Harry said quietly. Around them, the younger students fell silent, still trying to decide whether they wanted to be the ones to own a little piece of Ed's latest work. Seeing the conflicted looks on Harry, Ron, and Hermione's faces, Ed Moriarty smiled. "Don't worry, just take these unicorn cards and wander around the Gryffindor common room. If someone wants one, tell them the price. And it's fine if they don't sell. I'll pay you as I said. Harry, don't refuse for us," Ed added. "Do you think I'd make your friends work for free?" Harry had wanted to decline the payment, but Ed's tone made him stop. It wasn't about the money, it was principle, and Harry knew Ed well enough to know he meant it. "All right then," he said. No sooner had he spoken than a couple of Ravenclaw upperclassmen hurried over, chatted with Ed for a moment, and then pulled a few galleons from their pockets. They bought 2 cards on the spot, grinning as if they'd just struck a bargain. Harry and Ron gaped. Money was that easy to get? They had thought 5 galleons a little steep, but seeing the upperclassmen hand it over without hesitation stunned the three younger students who hadn't seen much of the world. Ed gave them a knowing look. These are magical items, and they're reusable. I'll be providing long-term updates for this set. I'll strengthen their powers and effects over time. Who's a more conscientious merchant than me? All right, you lot, move along, he continued, waving them off. Malfoy will be here soon, and don't you dare start a fight in front of me. Wait, Ed, why do you need Malfoy? Ron asked, suddenly wary. Of course I'm asking him to help sell them, Ed replied. Slytherins can be annoying, but they have money. For something this rare, there'll be younger students willing to pay. He glanced at Harry and Ron. If I don't ask Malfoy to help me sell to the Slytherins, did you expect me to ask you? Harry and Ron opened their mouths to protest that Slytherins weren't to be trusted, but then they remembered last year, when Malfoy had apparently given over 1,000 galleons, and Ed had shared some of that with them. The pureblood families in Slytherin really were wealthy. Besides, Ed had been cultivating a good relationship with Malfoy. He didn't expect Draco to refuse. With a final impatient wave, Ed urged them away. He didn't want to be present if a fight broke out. They left. Not far down the corridor, someone from Gryffindor ran over to ask what was going on, then pulled out money and bought a card. 3 cards at once, actually. One from Harry, one from Ron, and one from Hermione. Only then did the 3 of them realize how strange the situation had become. Ed stood off to the side, smiling as Draco Malfoy approached. Before long, the new novelty, destiny cards, were everywhere at Hogwarts. Even professors started to take notice. Most of the students couldn't see the true value hidden in the cards, but the professors could recognize the technical skill behind such an alchemical creation at a glance. In his office, Dumbledore considered a silver-white card depicting a unicorn that Professor McGonagall had handed him. He smiled. Is this the destiny card everyone's talking about? A little gadget made by Mr. Ed Moriarty. How did you come by it, Minerva? You didn't buy it from the students, did you? Of course not, McGonagall replied with a faint sniff. If they weren't paying attention in my class and were distracted by these, I confiscated them. Nothing to do with buying. Very much McGonagall's way. The students who'd had their cards confiscated were probably distraught. 5 galleons was no small sum for them. Dumbledore examined the card with interest. Very impressive alchemy. There are parts I don't understand. It must incorporate charms, transfiguration, and ritual magic as well. And other techniques I couldn't identify, McGonagall added, frowning as she looked at the light-reflecting card. You can't tell everything, Dumbledore, she said, genuinely surprised. She had meant only to collect a few trinkets to keep the students focused on their work, but seeing the card had left her astonished. When she had asked around, she discovered the cards were novelties made and sold by Ed Moriarty specifically for the students. Admittedly, she had always known Ed's talent exceeded that of other boys his age, but she had never expected him to produce something like this. Even you, Dumbledore, you can't work it out? How was this made? Professor McGonagall asked. Dumbledore shook his head. There must be knowledge and techniques here even we don't possess. If I try to force a full analysis now, the card itself will probably collapse. Moriarty had concentrated on the card's anti-tampering mechanism. He did not himself possess magic so dominant that no one else could examine it, but ritual magic is an ancient, obscure inheritance. His ritual was not complicated, but it was potent. Any attempt at deep analysis would trigger the ritual embedded in the card and set off a chain reaction that would destroy the card's entire system. That ensured even more powerful wizards would be unable to pry its secrets loose. Even if they dismantled the card, they would likely fail to grasp the alchemical knowledge encoded within it. It was an extra layer of protection. McGonagall opened her mouth to protest, but Dumbledore smiled and waved a hand. It's hardly surprising that young wizard Moriarty would have his own secrets, he said. From what I can see, he has a complete inheritance of ancient magic. There are traces on this card that don't belong to the magic we commonly use. It has the character of very old sorcery. And ritual magic. Frankly, even we only understand parts of it. For someone to use it so fluently, he's a genius. Perhaps we should look into whether he truly has ties to that ancient line of Moriarty's, McGonagall muttered. Dumbledore turned the card over in his hand. On the front it read, Holy Light Unicorn, 026, and at the bottom, Ravenclaw's motto was engraved in small, elegant script, Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure. On the back, a faint, rusted inscription had been worked into the ornamentation so subtly it might be missed. Time flows like water. Wisdom grows with each passing day. Dumbledore read the maxim aloud with a soft smile. I think Professor Flitwick would be delighted to see craftsmanship like this. Perhaps he already has, McGonagall said, shaking her head, though I suspect some of the students will be unable to resist playing with them in his class. It won't be mere play, Dumbledore pointed out. When McGonagall first received a card, she had tried it. By channeling a young wizard's magic through the card's preset circuits, it functions as training for the caster's own spells. The maker had encoded parts of the manipulation techniques used in the Patronus charm into the circuit. Repeatedly sending magic along those pathways is, in effect, practicing a condensed version of the Patronus. In other words, the cards can actually help students develop their magic. Truly a brilliant idea, Dumbledore said. He poured a little magic into the card he held. Instantly, a tiny unicorn the size of a puppy shimmered into being and trotted onto his desk, blinking enormous, entrancingly sad eyes at him. Even Dumbledore's famously unflappable heart softened. He reached out to touch it, and the corners of his mouth lifted. Unicorns, of course, generally shy away from male wizards, yet this one allowed him to stroke it. It was clear the creator had included elements such as unicorn tail hair in the card's construction, or had personally handled a unicorn to recreate its tactile realism. So the boy had actually touched a unicorn. Dumbledore frowned thoughtfully. They say unicorns never let male wizards handle them. How did he manage that? Or did he force one? The thought was too unpleasant to follow. Later, in the Ravenclaw dormitory, Moriarty lay on his bed with a satisfied smile. He had just completed the Haunted Dormitory Challenge, and before him, the monster book bearing his name, Moriarty's Monster Book, glowed faintly. He opened it and flipped through until he reached the page where the Holy Light Unicorn card had been recorded. The illustration glowed a pale white. Within it, a unicorn lay by a spring, utterly content. Moriarty's smile deepened. His method had worked. His guess had been correct. He had long noticed that as he fed magic into the monster book, the book behaved like a very high-level magical artifact. Much of his ability to create the card had come from the system's reward. He closed the book, pleased. The design had turned out exactly as he'd planned. He doubted it would ever be possible to create a second monster book exactly like that one. This truly was one of a kind, Moriarty's monster book. The magic he had put into it helped it grow, but his power was plainly too weak. He could barely nourish the thin page inside the book. It was like feeding a baby that would grow from 10 to 100 pounds. The baby only gained 90 pounds, but the food required to make that growth was far more than 90 pounds. The same principle applied to the monster book. This was only a unicorn. If it had been a dragon, his small infusion of magic wouldn't even have caused a ripple. All summer, he had been turning the problem over in his head, trying to figure out how to develop the monster book's abilities. And finally, he had a bold idea. It wasn't something he wanted to try outside school, so he only thought about it until he could work with the Room of Requirements tools. Once he was back at Hogwarts and had access to the room, he put the idea into practice, and it worked. Ed's eyes sparkled. He wasn't suddenly going soft. He wasn't about to start charity work or offer the little wizards a cheap sale. He touched the Holy Light Unicorn page. The derivative destiny cards he'd made, those smaller, copied cards, were designed so that when the little wizards infused magic into them to empower their summons, a small portion of that energy would be transferred to the main card, this page in his hand. That tiny drip of power served as nourishment for the Holy Light Unicorn MasterCard and allowed it to grow. Each student only lost an imperceptible fraction of magic during the infusion, but accumulated across dozens of little wizards and across repeated summons, those scraps added up. Every time the group poured magic into their unicorn copies, the monster book received a matching sliver. If the students wanted to maintain the summoning, they had to keep infusing magic. In the process, the monster book continued to gain energy. It was like he'd been attempting to raise the book on his own for ages. Now he had an army of helpers. Relief washed over him. Collective power really was something. Trying to cultivate a monster book alone would have taken forever. With this stream of magic coming in from the students, his workload eased considerably. He glanced down at the unicorn on the page. It looked a little larger than before, though he couldn't tell whether it was real growth or just wishful thinking. Satisfied, he closed the book and slept easily for the first time in a while. With the little wizards keeping the monster book fed, he no longer had to tend it every day, and he could finally set about making a second destiny card. Before, his own magic had been too meager to support more than one destiny card. Now the power problem was solved, and he didn't need to draw from his reserves to keep the book growing. He could spare the energy to craft another card. But what should it be? He certainly wouldn't make cards purely for their looks. The Holy Light Unicorn seemed to exist mainly as something pretty and cute at the moment, but unicorns were genuinely powerful magical creatures. The reason this destiny card behaved like a trinket was simply that it hadn't had time to grow. Give it a few years of steady nourishment from the little wizards, and it would develop a strong body and potent spellcasting abilities, perhaps even surpassing the limits of its ordinary biology. It's a pity Norbert isn't here, he thought. If he had been, making the second destiny card a dragon would have been ideal. Instead, he would look for creatures that were both useful and visually appealing. If a card was ugly, it wouldn't sell well among the students. Maybe he could borrow a tail feather from fox. Phoenixes molt as they age. A few extra feathers shouldn't be a problem. He'd ask the Red Bishop to stop by in a few days. All 30 destiny cards had sold out, and Harry and Hermione could hardly believe it. Gryffindor, even with all 7 years combined, barely had 100 students. Selling 30 cards meant almost a third of the upper years each owned one. Hogwarts wasn't crowded. Gryffindor and Ravenclaw each barely reached 100 students. Hufflepuff had a bit more, around 140 to 150, and Slytherin only had 70 or 80 across all 7 years. New student numbers had been falling in recent years. Ravenclaw had seen single-digit intakes for 2 years in a row, and the other houses were similar. That shrinking pool of little wizards spoke to a worrying future for the wizarding world. If they continued to prize pure-blood glory above everything, England might face a real population crisis in magical society. Except for the 3 cards he'd given to Harry and the others, all 97 remaining cards were gone. Even without finding anyone in Hufflepuff to help him sell them, Ed had shifted every last one. A few Hufflepuffs had even come to him directly to buy. Hermione and Harry had restocked from him as well. Ron was thrilled at the single galleon he'd made, but when he did the math, he gaped. Ed had casually made over 500 galleons in just a few days. Even after deducting his costs, Ed still cleared 200 or 300 galleons. Ron, feeling the emptiness of his own pockets, stared at Ed with new respect. Why, he wondered, were they both little wizards, and yet the other was so competent? Ed just smiled. This is what mastering a skill gets you. Alchemy costs a lot, but once you get results, making money becomes easy. He grinned. Think about Nicholas Flamel and the Philosopher's Stone. Do you imagine he's short on galleons? Harry and the others nodded. Compared to casually acquiring a former Philosopher's Stone, a few galleons did seem trivial. Ron glanced at Ed hopefully. Are you still selling cards? Ed shook his head. Not for now. He could have kept selling, later maybe, but that wasn't the point. Who said someone who bought a unicorn card once wouldn't want another? Card leveling, breakthroughs, enhancements. Sooner or later, he would roll out all of it and let the little wizards at Hogwarts experience microtransactions firsthand. The freebies were the most expensive in disguise. The first sale was a friendly price, not charity. For now, he didn't need to explain to the others what hunger marketing was. None of them were surprised. Ed must have put a long time into making so many cards, probably tinkering with them since the previous year. He still had classes to attend and couldn't spend every hour making money. In truth, he'd only needed to recoup his spending on alchemy. With 500 new galleons in hand, his pockets felt noticeably fuller. Hagrid had provided plenty of materials, but expenses multiplied fast. A wizard with ideas and plans found money drained away like water through a sieve. Ed had a list of things he wanted: a pair of dragonhide gloves made specifically for combat, an undetectable extension charm bag, a brand new set of robes so he didn't have to change after every experiment. Many of these items weren't sold in shops, they had to be custom made, and it was better for Ed to make them himself. Few alchemists, even famous ones, would take on small, quiet commissions. That night, after astronomy, as Ed headed back to the Ravenclaw Tower, something strange happened. From within the wall, he heard a voice. Not a human voice, but the rasping activation of his affinity for animal languages, which let him make sense of the sound. It was a cold, hoarse whisper that crawled under his skin, squeezing the heart, malice and hunger trailing off in long, sibilant hisses. "Let me tear you apart, kill you." Ed recognized it instantly. The basilisk. He wasn't alone. A number of Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw students were leaving astronomy with him, so he wasn't worried the creature would materialize right then. Still, the recognition was grim. In the second year, Hogwarts was especially vulnerable. Dumbledore's control over the castle's defenses was weaker for several reasons. He didn't even know what the Chamber of Secrets contained or where it was. The basilisk often moved through the castle's plumbing and pipes, not the main corridors, which made the statues and portraits that patrolled the castle largely useless. The basilisk's gaze could even incapacitate portraits. Even if they saw it, they couldn't reliably relay warnings. Between a hidden chamber and a creature that made many of the castle's sentries blind or mute, the second year was perhaps Hogwarts's most dangerous. Ed decided, then and there, that he needed to make a pair of protective glasses by alchemy as soon as he returned. If he ever crossed paths with the basilisk, he wanted every chance to survive. He also planned to station his ravens more thoroughly throughout the castle to act as his eyes. If one of his ravens died suddenly, he would be able to zero in on the basilisk's location. With those thoughts circling his head, Ed returned to the academy. He could understand the basilisk's hissing perfectly, but he wasn't a parcel mouth. Still, experience had shown him that even a non-Parselmouth could deliberately imitate Parseltongue closely enough to trigger whatever mechanism opened the Chamber of Secrets. The larger problem was that most Muggle electronic devices didn't work inside Hogwarts. But that wasn't insurmountable. Magical devices modified through alchemy behaved differently. He had bought a tape recorder in the Muggle world for exactly that reason. Ordinary electronics failed in the castle, but if he enchanted and adapted them, they might function. He'd been busy making magic cards lately and had put the project on hold, but given time he could modify several enchanted tape recorders. A recorder combined with an amplifying charm would certainly startle a basilisk. Still, the old lore about a rooster's crow giving fatal harm to a basilisk nagged at him. It wasn't as simple as an instant death. The crow might severely wound a basilisk or even leave it deaf, but it wouldn't necessarily kill it outright. If it were so easy, the creature wouldn't be as fearsome as it was. More realistically, a rooster's crow could scare one off or leave it vulnerable, but taking the monster down would be far from trivial. Ed ran the tactics through his head. He could try to bait the basilisk, cover his eyes to avoid its direct gaze, risk petrification, and spring the final attack. But that plan carried a high chance of catastrophe. He couldn't very well march to the headmaster's office and expect Fawkes to help him for free, either. The last time he'd summoned the headmaster's phoenix, the encounter had gone well enough, but he didn't want to rope the school's staff or pets into a dangerous scheme. Besides, he had motives of his own. The chamber held more than one prize: the secrets of Slytherin, whatever Tom Riddle's diary contained, and whatever items the basilisk guarded. If he could manage it himself, he intended to claim them all. Another reason for caution: his raven network. He'd sent birds to keep an eye on the castle, and so far none had been found dead, and there were no clear traces of a giant snake in the open. That suggested the basilisk hadn't been moving freely through halls. It had been slithering through the pipes and conduits instead, contained, at least for now. But that also meant someone had already gone down into the chamber. Ed resolved to post a few more ravens around the girls' bathroom entrance to see who tried to slip in. The birds could observe a lot, but they couldn't penetrate disillusionment charms or invisibility, which left gaps in his surveillance. The next afternoon, he made his way to charms class at an easy pace. Professor Flitwick's lesson was the perfect opportunity. Ed had questions about the Patronus charm. The Holy Light Unicorn destiny card he'd created had been selling well among the younger students, attracting a lot of magic feedback from young wizards and growing in effective power faster than he'd anticipated. That feedback had made him realize the cards he'd made earlier had oversights. There were improvements to be made, and the Patronus was one of the mechanics he needed to study more closely. Halfway to the classroom, he noticed a girl by the roadside whose appearance immediately singled her out. He'd seen her on the sorting day, a Ravenclaw first year, but she hadn't come forward like the other new students. She sat squatting on the grass with an oddly deliberate mess to her long, waist-length, golden blonde hair. It wasn't the hurried, study-driven tangle Hermione got into. This was styled chaos, a deliberate dishevel that made her look like she'd walked out of a different century. Her eyebrows were pale and faint, giving her a soft, almost fragile look, but her eyes were a little too large and perpetually rimmed with the tiredness of late nights. Strange trinkets decorated her: carrot-shaped earrings, a necklace strung through with what looked like butterbeer bottle caps, and even a few teeth from some unfamiliar magical beast. The overall effect was less student and more forest shaman, out of place among the neat young wizards. She stared at the grass as if it contained a map of the world, expression blank and concentrated. Ed crouched down beside her. First years should have been in class this afternoon. He wondered why she wasn't. "What are you doing?" he asked. The girl blinked and turned her gaze toward him. There was no surprise, no warmth in her expression, only a flat, unruffled focus that made her hard to read. She tilted her head and answered plainly, "I'm looking for the tracks left by blibbering humdingers. They should have passed through here just now." Ed blinked, taken aback. He'd misheard her the first time. "Sorry, what did you say?" "Blibbering humdingers," she repeated, as if the phrase contained all the explanation anyone could need. The little witch looked up and regarded Ed with a serious, unblinking stare. "It's a very rare magical creature," she said. "Only a few people can see it." Ed glanced across the empty green lawn. Well, he supposed blibbering humdingers could exist. My name's Ed Moriarty. Can I help you with something?" As a second year, helping first years who got lost was part of his routine. Luna blinked and answered in a flat voice, "I don't know where the Transfiguration classroom is." If you're lost, just say so, Ed thought. If I'd walked away, she'd probably have burst into tears. He felt a little helpless at having to scold a girl who sounded as calm about being lost as if she'd missed a piece of toast at breakfast. Still, first years often couldn't find their classes. Hogwarts' moving staircases and shifting corridors did that to people. Besides, this one looked solitary. It wasn't unusual. "Is this your first Transfiguration class? Professor McGonagall is very strict," he said, waving for her to follow. "By the way, you are." He already knew the answer, but asked anyway. "My name is Luna Lovegood." So it really was Luna, Ed thought. He nodded, then watched as she immediately changed the subject. "Did you make these destiny cards yourself?" Luna took a shimmering silver card from her pocket. A silver-white unicorn frolicked by a lake on the front. Ed was a little surprised a first year had a destiny card, expensive things usually, but then thought of Luna's pure-blood family and decided it made sense. "Unicorns are beautiful creatures, aren't they?" he said, picking up his pace and urging her to hurry. He still had charms to get to. Oh, Luna trotted to catch up. "Mr. Moriarty, do you have any ideas about making other magical creatures, like crumple-horned snorkax or blibbering humdingers?" "Wait, did you say crumple? What?" "Crumple-horned snorkax." Luna looked at him earnestly. "But I heard those two creatures are just imagined." Luna's confusion matched his. Ed paused, then tried to be helpful. "As far as research on magical creatures goes, there's no solid proof that those two definitely exist. But they do exist. Someone did say they saw them," Ed conceded. "I thought you'd understand." "You can't make definitive claims about things you can't prove," he said gently. Ed found himself being lectured by a first year. He smiled. You're right, Miss Lovegood. The evidence at best suggests that crumple-horned snorkacks and blibbering humdingers might exist. It doesn't prove they don't. I was too dismissive before. Luna seemed pleased. A wise judgment. Smart Ravenclaws don't jump to conclusions about things they don't understand. Outstanding wisdom is humanity's greatest wealth. She placed the card face down. On the back, ornate patterns formed a raven, and beneath them was a neat proverb: time flows like water, wisdom grows with each passing day. Thank you, Ed said, accepting the compliment. But I should warn you, you're almost late. He pointed toward the Transfiguration classroom. Professor McGonagall looked up, surprised to see them, then nodded in thanks as Luna hurried off. Ed bowed politely and broke into a jog toward Charms. He made it to the classroom only seconds before the lesson began. Professor Flitwick smiled. You're a bit late today, Mr. Moriarty, but not late enough to lose points for Ravenclaw. Now go back to your seat. Professor Flitwick winked at Aid and made a joking remark. Aid said nothing. He simply slipped to the side, found an empty seat, and sat down. Once the rest of the students had settled, Flitwick launched into that day's charms lesson. That evening at dinner, Aid ran into Harry, Ron, and Hermione again. Ron and Harry looked glum compared with Hermione. When Aid asked what was wrong, Hermione sighed and said, "We had another defense against the dark arts lesson with Lockhart." This year, after getting a new wand, Ron had actually been doing very well in most classes, sometimes even outshining Harry. Several professors had praised him for it. Lockhart, however, was an exception. If Ron had to name the most obnoxious teacher that semester, he couldn't decide which was worse, Lockhart or Snape. He still put Snape at the top of the list. Snape wasn't merely annoying, he was hateful. He's a fraud. Ron flopped his head down on the table. We've had 2 lessons, Hermione. Don't you see what kind of professor he is? One was an accident, Hermione said, and the other was just him reading aloud. Exactly, Ron protested. Hermione bristled at her friend's tone. You've both read Lockhart's books, haven't you? Think about it. He's done so many amazing things. That's just what he says, Harry grumbled. Seeing an argument about to flare up, Aid slipped away. On his way back to the Ravenclaw common room, he bumped into Luna Lovegood. Ravenclaw had always been tolerant of oddities. It welcomed students who showed their individuality. Aid himself was not exactly conventional. 2 birds often perched on his shoulders, and he sometimes stopped to feed ravens from a window. Yet he had been warmly received when he first arrived. Luna, though, was on another level of eccentric. Aid had heard some students whispering the nickname Loony behind her back. Even his fellow Ravenclaws found some of her mannerisms a little much. The conversation drifted back to the detention Harry and Ron had just received. This time, Aid learned it genuinely felt unfair to them. Usually detentions followed fights with Malfoy or other rule-breaking. This one, they insisted, had been pure bad luck. That blasted Peeves! Ron jabbed at the air with his fork and knife as if he could skewer the poltergeist. He threw a dung bomb in the corridor. Filch was nearby. I'm sure Peeves knew that and did it on purpose. Almost everyone had a quarrel with Peeves, but Harry and Ron seemed to attract his malice more than most. On this occasion, Peeves's timing was perfect. Filch spotted the mess, assumed Harry and Ron were responsible, and dragged them off to his office to write apologies. They'd been given several nights' detention, and Gryffindor lost points. No surprise they were in a foul mood. Aid frowned. He had been listening quietly and then asked, "Which corridor on the 3rd floor?" "The innermost one." Harry and Ron looked at him in surprise. "Yeah, how did you? Why were you there?" Aid asked. "That part of the corridor doesn't get much traffic." Exactly because it was quiet that Peeves' trick hit so hard. No witnesses, no one to back them up. But that wasn't the only reason Aid was interested. He had been watching that particular stretch of the 3rd floor for some time. At its end was Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, the entrance to the Slytherin Chamber of Secrets. Since the possibility that the basilisk had been unleashed, Aid had been keeping a close eye on that area. He'd set his ravens to watch it, and had even staked out Myrtle's bathroom himself for 2 nights, hoping to catch whoever might be using the chamber. Waiting had proved frustrating and inefficient. His time was precious, and he couldn't spend every night there. If he used ravens, they still might not find anyone going there at night. And even if someone did go, the birds might not recognize who it was. Ordinary ravens were only a bit stronger than normal animals now, not yet powerful enough to outmatch magically concealed things. If the person wore an invisibility cloak or a disillusionment charm, the ravens might never even notice. Ed had even considered replacing the ordinary birds with red bishop and black knight for surveillance, but he worried. If the basilisk really came out, what if something happened to them? That was why he'd been stuck. He'd hoped red bishop and black knight could figure out who was opening the Chamber of Secrets. If they watched for a few nights, they'd surely recognize the culprit. After all, both could penetrate invisibility and ordinary disillusionment charms. Identifying a student's appearance wouldn't be a problem. But the basilisk was too dangerous, and Ed hesitated to risk them. Still, he couldn't leave it like this forever. He thought it through carefully and decided to have red bishop and black knight keep watch on the bathroom at the relevant hour, with strict orders. The moment anyone entered, they should leave immediately. That way, even if the basilisk appeared, it wouldn't get a chance to harm them. As his contractors, red bishop and black knight had many special protections. Black knight, after all, embodied decay and curses and had an unusually high resistance to the dark arts. The basilisk's lethal gaze was a kind of curse, so Black Knight shouldn't be destroyed instantly. But Ed was still unwilling to take the risk. The basilisk could be dealt with later. If something happened to Black Knight, even if she could be resurrected, he couldn't bear the thought of her suffering. While Ed pondered, Harry and Ron had already started complaining to their friends. Harry and I saw Ginny go over, so we wanted to ask what was going on. But that's not the point. They looked even more dejected. On our way back from Filch, we ran into nearly headless Nick. He invited us to his 500th Death Day party on Halloween. A ghost's Death Day party? That's a bit of a one-off, Ed said, glancing at them with a trace of sympathy. Did you agree? Harry and Ron exchanged glances. Under Hermione's and Ed's raised eyebrow stares, they slowly nodded. We didn't think much of it and just said yes. Ron immediately regretted it. Why had his mouth been so quick? Nick had only tentatively asked, and their brains had shorted out. Now they wished they could take it back. Well, good luck to you, Ed said, reaching out to pat them. He was trying to be consoling, but the gesture only made them more downcast. On Halloween, the rest of the students would have a raucous feast in the Great Hall. Ron and Harry would be in a drafty underground chamber attending the death day of a ghost who'd been dead 500 years. Look on the bright side, mate, Ed added with a smile. Not every living person gets to go to a dead person's death day party. And a 500-year-old ghost, Ron muttered. And, Ed grinned, remember to eat plenty beforehand. Ghosts don't eat ordinary food. It won't suit you. Don't eat too much, Hermione warned, or you'll make a spectacle if you throw up. At the thought of rotten, foul-smelling ghost food, Harry and Ron turned even paler. Their stomachs churned. Tonight, Ed didn't go back to his dorm early as usual to clear dungeons and absorb his soul crystal and magic affinity potion. He prowled the castle instead, waiting outside the Gryffindor common room. He leaned against an open window, pretending to feed the ravens, and watched until nearly lights out. Just as he was about to head back to the Ravenclaw common room, he saw Ginny rush out from a distant corridor. Her hair was untidy, her clothes rumpled, and dirt smeared her neck. Seeing her in that state made Ed's heart leap. Before he could call out, he heard other footsteps behind her. He blinked, and then felt relief as Fred and George stepped into view, looking at him with puzzled smiles. Ed, what are you doing here? They asked. Ed held up the snacks he'd brought for the ravens and nodded toward the cawing birds. The twins understood at once. He looked back at Ginny, then at Fred and George. What are you two doing? Why do you all look like that? Don't worry, one of them said, smiling. We just got our dear sister to help us check a few little things around the castle. Well, of course they'd take their little sister on a night tour of Hogwarts. The treatment for a real sister did seem different from that for a younger brother like Ron. When Ron first arrived, Fred and George had never shown him the castle at night. Ed couldn't help a small, wry smile. Then why are you two looking like that? Fred and George wiped the sweat from their brows. We had a bit of an incident, Fred said. Peeves and Filch popped up out of nowhere. Fortunately, we reacted quickly and didn't get caught. Ed regarded the three of them with a puzzled look. It's not even past curfew. If you hadn't done anything wrong, why worry about Filch catching you? Fred chuckled and leaned toward Ed to whisper, We tossed a dung bomb at the entrance to the Slytherin common room. Oh, Ed remembered the last time something like that had happened. Harry and Ron had been blamed for a dung bomb, and the smell in the third-floor corridor lingered for days. Filch had been muttering and grumbling every time he passed. Imagining Filch discovering Fred, George, and Ginny now was easy. The punishment would be brutal. Filch must be furious, Ed said. Who knows? George shrugged. The twins hurried off toward the fat lady's portrait, shouted the password, and slipped inside. Ginny was about to follow when Ed called her back. She turned, a little surprised at being held up. Her eyes, bright and clear, blinked at him in a way that made it hard to read her expression. Ed hesitated, then asked, Ginny, have you ever heard of Tom Riddle? Ginny cocked her head, confusion plain on her face. No. Why? Who's Tom Riddle, Ed? Nothing, Ed said, forcing a smile. Go get some sleep. I'm heading back too. Ginny nodded and went inside. The next morning, Ed woke up groggy. He hadn't slept well, a restless night, which hadn't happened to him in a long time. Since he'd strengthened his mental power, he usually needed only a short sleep to recharge fully. Restless nights had become rare. Maybe he was just impatient. The lack of new leads on the Chamber of Secrets made him uneasy. It wasn't surprising, though. Tom Riddle couldn't restore his strength overnight. He had to lure the notebook's owner into trusting him, to open their heart, an effort that would take time and patience. The chamber wouldn't open quickly. It needed a process, and that process couldn't be rushed. Ed scolded himself. He'd already spent too much time on the chamber mystery and let his regular studies slide. The second destiny card he'd been planning still hadn't been designed properly. The Devil Street dungeon expedition, slated for this term, had been postponed. Part of the delay was practical. His Holy Light Unicorn card wasn't strong enough yet. He wanted to hold off until his monster book was stronger, so he could replace one of his ravens with that book and clear the Devil Street dungeon safely. Until then, the soul crystals from the dungeons under each of Hogwarts' 4 houses were invaluable for crafting destiny cards, replenishing his soul power, and strengthening his raven subordinates. He pressed his temples and let out a long breath. Every day since he'd arrived at Hogwarts had felt like a sprint. Busy, yes, but productive too. Ed climbed out of bed and left the dormitory while the castle was still half asleep. Ravenclaw had the best view in Hogwarts. From the common room's windows, you could see the castle falling away toward the Black Lake, the hills beyond, and wide stretches of sky. That sight usually calmed him, and this morning it steadied his frayed nerves. He took the stairs outside the common room up to a terrace he liked to use for music or quiet thought. He seldom came out so early, and he was surprised to find someone already there. The sun was just lifting over the horizon, and the soft gold light fell across a blonde figure sitting on the terrace, enjoying the breeze. Luna looked almost otherworldly in the morning light. The usual eccentricity of her manner seemed for once utterly fitting. She turned slightly when she noticed him. "Good morning, Ed," she said, a little surprised he'd come so early. "Good morning, Luna," he replied, and sat down beside her. For a few minutes, neither spoke. They just watched the sunrise. "What are you doing up here?" he asked finally. "I'm working on an article about the crumple-horned snorkack to send to my father's magazine," Luna said to herself. "Morning is the best time for inspiration." She glanced at him. "Have you read The Quibbler? Would you like me to send you a copy?" Just as Ed was about to refuse, Luna smiled and said, "All right, I'll have my dad send you 2 copies this week." Ed opened his mouth, then closed it, smiling and nodding. "Thanks, Luna." He hesitated, then asked, "Are you here to watch the sunrise, too?" Luna looked at him. Ed nodded. "Yes. Sometimes, when I can't figure things out, I come here to play the piano, or to do nothing in particular." "This is the first time I've watched the sunrise from here," she admitted. "Do you come here often?" Luna nodded, her eyes soft and distant. In that sing-song voice she always used, she said, "You look very confused. Is there something you can't decide?" Ed thought she sounded more like a clairvoyant than Professor Trelawney. He shook his head. I just haven't figured some things out yet." She inclined her head and in that ethereal tone began as if singing, "Temporary troubles are not permanent. What matters is having the determination, the courage, and the cleverness to face them." She gave the Ravenclaw motto softly, "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." Staring toward the rising sun, she continued, "My mother used to say that no matter what difficulties or choices you face, if your heart is turned toward the light and hope, if you hold fast to your courage and use your strengths, one day you will see the light again." Her voice drifted through the early morning tower, and for a moment Ed felt dazed. He shook his head to clear his thoughts. "Your mother was a very wise witch, Luna." "She was," Luna said with a small smile. "She loved experimenting. Once a spell went wrong and she died. I was only 9. The conversation had grown unexpectedly heavy. "I'm sorry, Luna," Ed said. "I didn't mean to bring that up." "It's all right," Luna replied. "I remember her. She was very good to me." Ed was a little stunned by the sudden intimacy of the moment. Luna's gaze stayed on him, steady and calm. "You look tired, Ed," she said. "I don't know what you're dealing with, but you always seem to try to carry everything on your own. My mother used to tell me no one can do everything by themselves. Everyone needs help sometimes." She looked at him seriously. "I don't know what's on your mind, but you're not alone." "Not alone?" Ed repeated, a faint smile forming. He realized he'd been worrying too much. What did it matter if he hadn't figured out who opened the Chamber of Secrets yet? The original story's heroes still survived. His involvement hadn't made things worse. What he needed was to get stronger, improve his skills, and keep developing his game cheats. Strength was the foundation of everything. If he became powerful, even on par with Lord Voldemort, his current fears would seem small. "Thank you, Luna. I think I understand," he said. Luna nodded, as if whatever he'd understood wasn't particularly important. "You must read my article about the crumple-horned snorkack," she said. "All right, I will." "Want to go down for breakfast together?" Luna tilted her head. "I still have some back issues of the Quibbler. You can look through them first. I think you'll be interested." Ed almost said no. He didn't really want to read the Quibbler, but Luna's expectant face and her earlier kindness stopped him. He nodded. Set aside the nonsense, and the Quibbler could be entertaining. It wasn't trying to be an authority. It reveled in the outrageous. The crumple-horned snorkack, the blibbering humdinger, and other fantastical claims. The paper often offered page after page of elaborate evidence for these creatures. If someone knew nothing at all, those arguments might seem convincing. Still, some of the reports were thought-provoking. One article that caught Ed's eye described a creature called the Dream Dragon. The Dream Dragon was said to be an illusory, Eastern dragon-like creature that existed only in dreams, feeding on the energy of beautiful dreams. It wandered the dream world, finding the sweetest dreams and drawing sustenance from them. It did not turn dreams into nightmares or harm the dreamer. The relationship was more like a gentle symbiosis, making already lovely dreams even sweeter. Many people who had especially good dreams reported seeing such a dragon, and over time, it had become a symbol of good luck. Ed stared at the string of carefully argued reports and drifted into thought. Put beside sightings of a crumple-horned snorkack or a blibbering humdinger, the idea of a dream dragon did sound more plausible. And then there was the other possibility. People might only dream of such a thing because they had read about it. If someone came across these reports during the day and dismissed them, they might still dream of the dragon that night simply because the idea had been planted in their head, which raised the old, insoluble question. Are our dreams shaped by what we think about during the day, or do they point to things that actually exist? It was, in the end, a paradox. Penelope settled beside him, smiling, and handed him a glass of milk. "Try this, Ed." "Thanks, Penelope." He took a casual sip, then turned toward Luna. "This creature is pretty interesting. Could you help me find more on it?" Luna looked over at what he'd been reading, then peered at the paper again. When she realized what it described, she brightened. "Ed, you mean a feathered serpent dragon." "What's that?" he asked. "It's like a feathered serpent god," Luna said calmly, as if reciting something she had always known. "But different. It's a dream dweller, formless, though it usually appears as a long serpentine dragon in people's sleep. Very magical. Hard to see." If Ed hadn't already read the entry in Fantastic Beasts, Luna's quiet certainty might have convinced him. Still easier to find than a crumple-horned snorkack, right? He said, half joking. Luna nodded earnestly, apparently missing the humor. When she left, Ed exhaled long and slow. Being with Luna was oddly wearing. Without the halo of sunlight that seemed to belong to the top of the Hogwarts tower, the ethereal fairy-like impression disappeared and she became simply Luna, the eccentric Ravenclaw girl. It was a lot. "Is she a first year this year?" he asked. Penelope covered her mouth to hide a laugh. "She seems like a very lively first year." "Or just a bit eccentric," Ed said. "If you've got something to say it." But Penelope had leaned over to read the report herself and was intrigued. She waved the paper teasingly. "Ed, you don't actually believe this is true, do you?" "Never abandon the heart of a seeker of knowledge," he said. "We Ravenclaws pursue the impossible." "That's true." Penelope nodded, amused. To them, knowledge wasn't simply what the textbooks said. Doubting accepted answers was part of learning. They talked a while about classes and arrangements and agreed to practice charms together that weekend. When Penelope rose to go, Ed suddenly reached out and pressed her hand. "What's wrong?" she asked, startled but not displeased by the attention. He hesitated a moment, then said, "You should avoid going out alone for a while or going into secluded parts of the castle. Try to stick with other Ravenclaws." "Why?" She looked at him, puzzled. "Don't ask. Just listen." He spread his hands in a helpless gesture. "I'm not trying to be overprotective." "Am I in danger from you then?" Penelope teased, her lips curving. "Who knows?" she added with a laugh. "Maybe little Ed has tired of the old and moved on to a pretty junior." Ed rolled his eyes. This older senior was being petty. He'd only said a few words. He grew serious again. "I'm not joking, Penelope. My raven brought word that something's wrong on campus. There's danger lurking." Penelope's frown deepened. Danger at Hogwarts? With Dumbledore in charge, who would dare? But looking at Ed's earnest expression, she finally nodded. Relief washed over him. He'd been worried she wouldn't listen. He remembered, too, that Penelope had been listed among the basilisk's targets in the account of the second year. He didn't know whether his interference in the past had altered that fate. The thought settled over him like a cold draft, and he couldn't tell which was more worrying. That history might yet repeat itself, or that it might already have. "If you hear anything strange coming from a corner, don't go toward it. Turn around and run," Ed said after a moment's thought. "And if you have to go down a corridor or into a corner by yourself, hold up a mirror first. Of course, it's better to go with someone." Penelope's brows drew together. She studied Ed closely. He didn't strike her as someone who traded in half-truths or tall tales to get attention. If he were that sort of person, she would have called him out long ago. Their relationship wouldn't have stayed so ambiguous. She nodded slowly, obviously taking him seriously. For a flash of a second, Ed thought, "No, Professor Flitwick, why are you playing matchmaker?" He almost laughed at the thought, then remembered how the afternoon had started. Ed had almost put the whole Chamber of Secrets business to one side. He'd decided to focus on improving himself on his own timetable. Studies, practice, and a steady routine. He was following that plan when Professor Flitwick had suddenly cornered him and invited him to afternoon tea. Expecting a conversation about charms, Ed accepted without hesitation. He didn't expect the Ravenclaw head of house to be recruiting him for the Quidditch team. Professor Flitwick," Ed began, trying to sound polite, "I'm not really interested in playing Quidditch." He forced a wry expression. There wasn't much he could do. His schedule was already packed. By day, he had classes and extra charms practice. By night, he was in the room of requirement, making destiny cards or exploring those odd game-like dungeons that cropped up. On weekends, he met Penelope for more charms practice. He liked to walk by the lake when he had a spare hour, sometimes play the piano on the terrace before bed. He also kept an eye on the information the Ravens relayed. He didn't have time for Quidditch training, not if he was to keep up the rest of his life. And even if he did have the time, it wasn't the kind of commitment he could drop in and out of. Being on the team meant more than attending a match now and then. If he signed up and skipped practices, it would be irresponsible. He didn't dislike flying, but he didn't plan on joining the team. Flitwick regarded him with a gentle, almost conspiratorial smile. "It's like this, Ed," he said. "I know your concerns. I know you're valuable to the school in other ways. I'd agree. Under ordinary circumstances, yes, Quidditch would be a poor use of your time." Flitwick didn't place the Quidditch Cup on a pedestal the way McGonagall did. Winning was pleasant, but it wasn't the be-all and end-all for him. The problem was that this year, the Ravenclaw team had come to him in a terrible state, and the head of house couldn't put them off. Apparently, the new season had started, and already the team had rushed, one after another, into Flitwick's office. A cluster of young Ravenclaws, led by Captain Roger Davies, had made a very earnest case. They desperately needed two capable beaters. Last year's match against Slytherin had left a stubborn impression on them. In that game, their opponents had nearly knocked the whole team off their brooms. The girls had learned the hard way that if you can't hit people back out on the pitch, you're not going to last long. It wasn't about fair play. It was about surviving long enough to play the ball. Huddled in the tiny office, the team had pleaded that Ravenclaw simply didn't have the muscle on the pitch this year. "If we don't bring in two strong beaters," Flitwick told Ed, "we'll get trampled by Slytherin." They were very, very upset, and I confess, so was I to see them in such a state. Ed couldn't help a small chuckle. He hadn't expected the Ravenclaw team to come to this. The image of a crowd of tearful, determined Ravenclaws campaigning for better beaters was absurd and oddly endearing. Flitwick's smile widened. "It won't take much of your time," he persuaded. "We're asking you only to stand in as a beater for the match against Slytherin. 2 short practice sessions to coordinate with the other beater and the team before the match. That's all. You won't be expected to attend regular Quidditch training." Ed stared at him. The offer was unexpectedly specific, and worst of all, hard to refuse. 2 practices in a single match was a lot less intrusive than joining the whole season. It sounded manageable until he counted the hours in his head again. He pictured the room of requirement, the small private routines he'd carved out for himself, Penelope's steady, exacting practice sessions, the late-night dungeon runs. Still, he also thought of the team piling into Flitwick's office, of Captain Davies's earnest face, of Ravenclaw standing on that pitch last year and being steamrolled. The school's teams mattered in small ways that reached beyond trophies. Ed felt the tug in 2 directions, his own schedule and a house that needed help. He opened his mouth to answer. Ed had a rough idea what Davis and the others meant. They weren't asking him to join the Quidditch team as a player so much as to provide outside muscle. They couldn't beat Slytherin on the field and wanted someone to intimidate them off it. The thought made him rub his temples, but he couldn't refuse Professor Flitwick. He nodded. "All right," he said. "Excellent." Flitwick beamed. The little professor was relieved. Finally, he could explain things properly to the girls. If they kept coming to his office in tears every few days, which professor could cope with that? Flitwick's desk was piled with all kinds of sweets. Hospitality was standard for any young witch or wizard who showed up, not a special favor for Ed. No wonder the students adored the tiny, cheerful charms teacher. Flitwick urged Ed to help himself and asked if he had any questions about his studies. Of course he did. Learning always raised new questions. Ed had no afternoon classes, and Flitwick had invited him for tea that afternoon on purpose. With nothing pressing, Ed stayed. They talked charms, swapped idle chatter, and spent a relaxed, pleasant afternoon. After the conversation, Ed found his mind buzzing with ideas for his next charms experiments, ideas that needed verification. He also realized the regular library wouldn't be enough. By the end of last year, he'd reached the level a typical 5th year should have, but to go deeper, he needed restricted section material. Last Christmas, several professors had thoughtfully sent him books and borrowing slips for the restricted section. Since then, when he hit a stumbling block, he usually asked Flitwick for help. This year, though, he had a better option, Lockhart. It turned out Lockhart wasn't entirely useless. After a few compliments about Lockhart's books and a remark that he wanted to delve into some of the stories but lacked reference material, Lockhart happily signed several restricted section borrowing slips without even asking which books Ed intended to take out. Ed suspected Lockhart would sign anything, even a dark arts text, but he decided not to abuse that generosity. Madame Pince would log every borrowing. It would look odd for a young wizard to be seen checking out banned volumes. Instead, Ed borrowed manuals on animagus transfiguration and advanced potion theory. Animagus work was dangerous. If he'd asked McGonagall, she probably would have forbade him outright. Too many adult wizards had failed at human transfiguration. For now, he would study animagus on his own. Once he had demonstrable progress, he could approach McGonagall, and she might be inclined to offer guidance rather than refuse him. Because he had promised Flitwick to help the Quidditch team when needed, Ed had also taken a quick look at the house lineups for the year. Gryffindor's roster was unchanged. They retained the championship lineup from last year. Slytherin, however, had made a change. They had a new second-year seeker. Lucius Malfoy had evidently bought his son a place on the team, even gifting Slytherin 7 brand-new Nimbus 2001s without blinking. A Nimbus 2001 was worth well over 2,000 galleons. Using that kind of money simply to secure Malfoy's spot said a lot about the family's priorities. Malfoy could fly, certainly better than some, if not as naturally gifted as Harry. The seeker position favors agility, keen observation, and pure flying skill rather than brute force. It's usually given to smaller, quick players or those with a long reach, the sort of player Ron, of all people, still admires. For Malfoy, the role had an added appeal. Seeker can decide a match outright. Malfoy was, at heart, arrogant and self-centered, and he wanted to go toe-to-toe with Potter. Ravenclaw had recruited well. Cho Chang, now old enough, had returned as their seeker after sitting out last year. Hufflepuff, too, had found a fine seeker. The tall Cedric Diggory surprised everyone with his flying. With seekers like Potter, Chang, Malfoy, and Diggory, the coming season promised some intense matches. Overall, the strength of the school teams in the 4 houses had risen a little this year. But there was no doubt that Slytherin had improved the most. The advantage of 7 Firebolt 2001s across a Quidditch pitch is obvious. That's also why Ed had always been skeptical about Quidditch. If it's supposed to be a competition, everyone should be using the same model of broom. What's the point of a match when the brooms themselves have different performances? Is it a contest of skill or a show of who has more money? It's like putting a professional race car driver up against someone in a beaten-up old AE86. The result is hardly surprising. Wizards might pay lip service to fair play, but not all of them take it to heart. So when Ed heard that Gryffindor and Slytherin were arguing over use of the Quidditch pitch, he wasn't surprised. Those 2 houses argued about things like that almost every year. This year, though, the tension was sharper. Malfoy sneered that Gryffindor's brooms were nothing but rejects, and Hermione shot back that Malfoy had only Slytherin because of his money. Old grudges and summer moods faded fast. Malfoy soon reverted to calling Hermione a mudblood. And then, of course, things escalated. Hot-headed Harry and Ron drew their wands and hit back hard. They didn't just humiliate Malfoy. They transfigured him into something resembling a pig's head and charmed him to vomit slugs. 2 Slytherin boys who tried to break it up found themselves knocked flat by quick charms, and before long, the whole thing turned into a brawl. That day, the Gryffindor Quidditch practice didn't happen, but everyone involved landed their blows cleanly. Points were deducted from all Gryffindor and Slytherin players who took part. As the instigators, Malfoy and Harry were both given detention. Harry and Ron didn't care. Seeing Malfoy reduced to that ridiculous state had them grinning even during their punishment. It helped that the 2 of them had been taking charms lessons with Ed and had a number of run-ins with Malfoy since they arrived. Potter and his friends rarely came out on the losing end. Malfoy, for his part, had a short memory. Once his wounds healed, he quickly forgot the lesson and started provoking them again, only to be beaten and detained once more. If loving Potter meant sacrificing himself to get a detention, then Malfoy's devotion was impressive in its own absurd way. Professor Lockhart eventually discovered Harry and Ron's detention, and with that theatrical chuckle of his, begged them to help him reply to his fans who'd written to his books. That saved the 2 of them from Filch's harsher chores. Filch never let students use wands to be lazy, and the idea of sitting in Lockhart's office writing flowery letters was infinitely preferable to scrubbing bathroom floors. Malfoy, on the other hand, hadn't yet shaken off all his curses and still had to serve his time cleaning the lavatories. Once again, the poor injured young Master Malfoy act was in full swing. The castle filled with the sweet scent of pumpkin. Ed glanced at the giant jack-o'-lantern, big enough for 2 or 3 people to sit inside, and thought of Hagrid's patch. Hagrid had been expelled from Hogwarts, but his growth charms had obviously been applied with care. His pumpkins were magnificent. Everyone knew Hagrid's use of magic was supposed to be a secret after his expulsion, so most people politely pretended not to notice how skillful his gardening was. Ed was no exception. Halloween came around quickly, and the new students were buzzing with anticipation. Halloween is the first real festival for first years at Hogwarts, and the professors and older students make a point of making it feel like home. Unsurprisingly, Ed was once again pressed into service by Professor Flitwick, this time to help decorate the Great Hall. The castle was already a maze of bats and phantoms. Someone had even conjured a huge hairy spider over the main doors. The entrance was rigged so that if a student brushed certain webs, the spider would drop, bundle them up, and dangle them in the air for a minute before releasing them. The first victims were terrified, but once others realized what was happening, many began seeking the thrill, or the prank, on purpose. Penelope had been egging people on to try it, but Ed wasn't that foolish. Still, plenty of Gryffindors rushed the spider like overexcited daredevils, earning laughter from students in the other houses. Ed wondered what Ron would do if he ran into that spider. Would he freeze in fear, or faint outright? On reflection, maybe it was just as well Ron and his friends had skipped the party. The other surprise came when one of the first years discovered that the professors had secretly hidden candies inside some of the enchanted lights. Once word spread, a crowd of students began leaping and searching the Great Hall, hunting down the sweets the staff had tucked away. The hall filled with laughter as more and more little wizards joined the treasure hunt, the Halloween decorations and Hagrid's pumpkins making it all feel perfectly, gloriously like a proper Hogwarts Halloween. Ed had also found a small handful of fizzing whizbees tucked inside a pumpkin lantern and shared them with Penelope. He'd meant to give some to Red Bishop and Black Knight as well, but the 2 little ravens clearly remembered that peculiar taste from last year. They shook their heads and looked completely uninterested, so he gave up on that plan. The feast began. The Great Hall was hung with lanterns and streamers. Ghostly apparitions prowled among the tables, making a few students scream. Golden platters laden with food appeared in front of everyone. Ethereal music came from all corners, and pale skeletons nudged themselves up from the floor. Only these had clearly been tinkered with by a professor, so instead of being terrifying, they were almost cute, striking exaggerated poses and tap dancing across the hall. The place filled with shouts, cheers, and the clatter of plates and applause. This Halloween, with no unexpected interruption from that Quirrell fellow, was infinitely more entertaining than last year. The feast wound down amid laughter, and students began to drift away to their house gatherings. Each house customarily held its own celebration in its common room afterward. Ravenclaw was no exception. It was rare to see the Ravenclaw common room without someone reading, but on this evening the crowd moved on up the stairs. Then, as they climbed, the noise abruptly cut out, as if a giant mute button had been pressed. The students in front halted, voices died, and the silence spread back through the line. Penelope, exercising her prefect's authority, parted the crowd and pulled Ed forward. On the wall next to the third-floor bathroom, written in something that could have been blood or paint, a chilling message glowed beneath the dim torchlight. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. Beneath the writing, Filch's favorite cat, Madame Norris, who sometimes slipped into Ed's lap to have her back scratched, hung like a dried rag. Her tail was tied to the bracket by the torch. Her body was stiff as iron, eyes wide and staring. Beside her, a raven was suspended in the same manner, rigid and upside down. A large puddle of water had spread across the corridor for some unknown reason. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stood in the middle of it, trembling as dozens of students stared at them. The sight froze the crowd. Then, from somewhere in the assembly, Draco Malfoy's sneering voice rang out, eager and loud. "Enemies of the air, beware! Next, it'll be you, Mudblood!" "Shut up, Malfoy!" someone snapped. Ed pushed through the press and stepped forward, glancing toward the Slytherin side. His voice was low but hard. "If you're the ones who did this, say so now. You can explain it properly to the professors later." Malfoy's smugness went instantly pale, as if someone had put a hand over his throat. He wouldn't admit it. Doing so would be the same as inviting the worst kind of trouble. Ed didn't concern himself with Malfoy's feelings. The message made one thing painfully clear. The Chamber of Secrets had indeed been opened again. He'd briefly considered leaving Black Knight or Red Bishop behind earlier to investigate, and now he felt a grim sort of relief that he hadn't. Given the state of that raven, any investigating birds would likely have met the same fate. He stroked Red Bishop and Black Knight, who were agitated but alive, on his shoulder, and joined the prefects in trying to restore order. Initial confusion was giving way to fear. Screams started to ripple through the students. Fortunately, Ed standing among his peers counted for something. Working with the prefects, he managed to calm the crowd just enough to prevent a full-blown panic. The commotion drew Filch. Seeing Madame Norris dangling from the wall, the caretaker went nearly mad with grief and fury and immediately accused Harry and Ron of murder. He paid no heed to Ed's attempts at explanation. Only when Dumbledore arrived with a group of professors did the situation begin to settle. Dumbledore surveyed the writing, the cat, and the dead raven, then cast a quick, appraising look at Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Without saying anything further, he had a professor take the three of them off to his office for questioning, while the prefects organized the rest of the students back to their houses. "Mr. Potter, Mr. Weasley, Miss Granger, please come with me," Dumbledore said. He then turned his attention to Ed, who had been standing just behind the prefects. "If Mr. Moriarty is interested, please come along." Ed was slightly surprised, but if he could learn more from the professor, he nodded and moved over to where Harry and the others stood, looking tense. The group visibly relaxed when they saw him, as if they'd found a spine. Their eyes pleaded with Ed, saying without words that they weren't the culprits. Professor Lockhart arrived a little late. After hearing Dumbledore, he brightened and chirped, "Come to my office. My office is upstairs. We can discuss it there." "Thank you, Gilderoy," Dumbledore said, and everyone followed the excited professor up to his dim, cluttered office. Ed had been in Lockhart's office more than once this term to get signatures for his book slips. Harry and Ron knew it well, too, from writing replies and serving detentions. Now a sudden crowd poured in, startling the portraits that lined the walls. The painted figures scurried back into their frames, embarrassed. Some of them had coiffures that were plainly unfinished. Dumbledore placed Madame Norris and a motionless raven on the desk and examined them closely. Everyone else fell silent, holding their breath, afraid even small movements might disrupt his judgment. Only Lockhart panted with barely contained excitement, as if he'd stumbled into excellent material for his next book. Harry's stomach tightened. From where he stood, he could see Snape lurking in the shadow by the door, that cruel little smile twisting his mouth, too pleased at the prospect of trouble for the students. Harry thought, Snape must be delighted at the idea of me being expelled. They were all flustered. It was just like last time, when Filch blamed them for Peeves's dung bombs. It hadn't been their fault then either, yet with a crowd of witnesses it was hard to explain. All they could do now was hope Dumbledore found some clue and spared them from blame. Filch stood by the door, sniffling, while Lockhart fidgeted in front of Dumbledore, offering opinions. "A very powerful charm," Lockhart proclaimed. "I'm sure a rare transfiguration hex was used. I've witnessed similar things on my travels. If I'd arrived sooner, perhaps I could have saved them." Dumbledore ignored the theatrics. He drew his wand and murmured a string of complex incantations over the still bodies. Ed had never heard spells like those, yet they produced no change. Like Madame Norris, and the raven remained utterly unresponsive. The color drained from the room. If there was some corner of the dark arts that stumped even Dumbledore, then whatever had done this was more frightening than they'd imagined. Lockhart couldn't help himself. "They're dead, I tell you. I've seen this sort of thing before. he began, only to be cut off by the disapproving looks of the other professors. At that moment, the red bird perched on Ed's shoulder, Red Bishop, fluttered down onto the desk. It tapped the raven gently with its claws and let out two sharp caws. Dumbledore looked up at Ed. "What is it, Ed? Has Miss Red Bishop found anything?" Dumbledore said the bird's name as if it were a friend. Ed signaled quietly for the Red Bishop to return. The bird hopped back to his shoulder, looking a little guilty as if it had been inspecting someone else's territory. He soothed both the Red Bishop and the dark-feathered Black Knight on his other shoulder, then said to Dumbledore, "There's nothing new, Professor, but the Red Bishop thinks the raven shouldn't be dead yet. Madame Norris looks the same." Filch's eyes shone. Dumbledore nodded slowly. "Very keen observation. They are not dead. Both have been petrified." "A severe dark arts," someone whispered. Filch snapped at the students, his voice rising. "It's them! They were the ones mucking about in this corridor before. I punished them. They must be seeking revenge." Harry and Ron exchanged a look. Filch could almost make his accusations sound plausible. Snape's cold, mocking laugh cut through. "Indeed, Professor Dumbledore," he said with relish. "These young wizards are capable of malice well beyond their years. I recommend immediate expulsion." Ed felt his eyes roll of their own accord. How eager was Snape to be rid of Harry? Or was he grimly sure the headmaster would never agree and simply wanted the satisfaction of saying it aloud? Dumbledore waved a calming hand. "This is a very advanced curse. It is not the sort of thing first-year students could cast." "Humph. That's not necessarily true," Snape snapped back, unable to hide the contempt in his voice. Snape snorted coldly and swept his gaze over Ed. Ed shrugged. "Why are you looking at me? I was with everyone in the great hall at the feast, and Penelope was right beside me. I have a witness, so don't even think about framing me." He could see from Snape's expression that the professor was already aware of that. Otherwise, Snape would have piled him onto the list of suspects without hesitation. Cat murderer. "So, Mr. Potter," Snape went on, turning his attention to Harry, "why weren't you in the Great Hall with the rest of the students during the feast? Why were you in that corridor instead?" That was the crux of the matter. Harry and the others had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were grasping for an explanation, and finally offered one. They'd gone to nearly headless Nick's Death Day party, with hundreds of ghosts who could vouch for them. Snape laughed, a sound like cold metal. "Attending a Death Day party? Mr. Potter and his friends certainly have eccentric pastimes, but," a conspiratorial smile flickered across his face, "why did you then not come back to the feast? Why did you run up to the corridor above? As I understand it, the food for the dead is hardly to the taste of normal wizards." Harry was about to say that he'd heard something, but Ron nudged him, and he changed his answer at once. "We weren't hungry." The denial was undermined by two stomachs that chose that moment to rumble loudly. Snape's smile widened. He looked at Dumbledore. "Clearly, Headmaster, they are not telling the truth. I suggest expelling them and sending them to Azkaban, where they belong." Professor McGonagall's brow creased. Yes, it had been suspicious for the children to be there, but she could not imagine them capable of such cruelty. It was far too soon for such a severe conclusion. "Severus, it's too early to make such accusations. There is no evidence to prove that Mr. Potter had anything to do with this." "That's right, Severus," Dumbledore said quietly. "Without proof, we must assume them innocent." Filch, distraught, cried from the edge of the room, "My cat, Mrs. Norris, she's been petrified. Someone must be punished." Dumbledore held up a hand and addressed Filch with patient reassurance. "We can cure her. Professor Sprout has a crop of mandrakes that once mature that will allow us to brew the proper draught to reverse petrification." Ed glanced at Dumbledore and found his thought sharpening. With Dumbledore's stature and contacts, fresh mandrakes would be findable if he truly wanted them. Dumbledore could, if he chose, bring matters to a head quickly. Was he merely letting things run their course, or was he waiting for something? Ed didn't voice the suspicion. Lockhart's florid voice piped up, bursting with its usual self-assurance. "I'll brew it. I've made at least 100 of those draughts. I could brew a mandrake restorative in my sleep." Snape cut him off with a thin, contemptuous sneer. "Am I not the potions master at this school?" The room went awkward. Lockhart, deflated, could only force a smile. Dumbledore turned to the students. All right, you may go. Harry and his friends, as if granted a pardon, hurried from the room. Ed nodded to the professors and followed. Once they had put some distance between themselves and the staff room, Ed stopped and raised his wand. Silencio! The corridor fell silent. He released 2 ravens he kept tucked away for such moments. They flapped to either side of the hall and circled, keeping watch. Only when he was sure no one would come near did he lower his wand and turn to the 3 of them. Explain, he said seriously. Tell me exactly what happened. Why were you near that bathroom? He let a small, ironic smile tug his lips. I know there are things you can't tell the professors, but do you not trust me? The 3 exchanged looks, then nodded. Harry took a breath. Sorry, Ed. It's just on our way back from the feast I heard something odd. He scratched the back of his head, hesitant. But Myrtle was crying so loudly, I couldn't be sure I heard it right. What did you hear? Ed asked. He already had a theory in mind, dangerous and not something he wanted to test without preparation. If a basilisk truly prowled the castle, the idea of hunting Slytherin's treasure sounded foolish. He needed facts. Harry swallowed. I don't know. It sounded like something saying it was hungry. It said it wanted to kill people. The weird thing was, we couldn't find where it was. It was like a ghost. It passed through the ceiling, went all the way up to the 3rd floor corridor, and we chased after it. That's when we saw what happened. Harry hesitated. He had wanted to mention it sooner, but Ron and Hermione had interrupted him then. Ron now looked at Ed, worried. Ed, shouldn't we tell the professors about this? Ed's face hardened. You did tell them, he said. And what happened? Harry's shoulders slumped. We did, but Snape didn't believe us. McGonagall and the headmaster they were trying to be fair, but without proof, they'll keep looking at you as suspects, Ed finished quietly. All right, if what you heard said it was hungry and wanted to kill, then that isn't ordinary magic. Tell me everything you remember, every word, every sound, nothing left out. Ed shook his head. No need, he said. Ron's right. It isn't normal to hear things no one else can without a reason. This could be a curse, some dark arts, a magical creature, or just some elaborate prank. He rubbed his chin. Did anyone else hear it? Ron? Hermione? They both shook their heads. No. Ed sighed, then let the trio's little illusions fall apart with a few blunt words, but Harry and the others still relaxed when they heard him. At least Ed believed Harry. That was something. Ed smiled faintly. Since only Harry heard it and not Ron and Hermione, either Harry, you had some kind of hallucination, or whatever made the noises normally inaudible to everyone else. It would mean you have something different about you. He paused. Or it's not human. You said it seemed able to get through the ceiling. A normal person can't do that. It could be some sort of magical creature. He didn't need to finish. His hint was enough. Or a ghost, a spirit. Or we should look at it a different way, Hermione interrupted. If we can't identify who did it, we can at least look at who would benefit. If the Chamber of Secrets really was opened, who gains from that? She asked. For a beat, Harry's eyes went straight to Malfoy. Could it be Malfoy? He blurted. Ed made a small, exasperated noise and looked as if he wanted to bang his head. Of course, whenever something bad happened, Harry and his friends were quick to suspect Malfoy. It was the easiest answer. Harry looked puzzled by the name. He didn't know the history, so Ed explained. Slytherin left Hogwarts because he disagreed with the others about who should be taught magic. He hid a secret chamber in the school and left something inside for his true heir. The story goes that only that heir can open the chamber and release whatever is in there to purify the school, to get rid of those he considered unworthy. Ron and Harry both made a shocked sound, unworthy of learning magic, like muggle-born witches and wizards. So you see why Malfoy would seem suspicious, Ed added. That kind of talk fits him. They all fell into quiet plotting. Ron and Harry already loved the idea of watching Malfoy. Hermione, however, narrowed her eyes at Ed. He knew an awful lot about this, and he seemed unnaturally calm. Ed, she said slowly, is there more you know? Something you're not telling us? Hermione's instincts were sharper than the other two, as usual. Ed had been thinking the same thing. Between the danger of the chamber and what he'd told Luna earlier, he knew he couldn't handle everything alone. If he focused on his studies, stayed out of trouble, and maybe recovered the diary. That would be best. But he couldn't let Harry and Hermione walk into dangerous situations completely unaware. He weighed it for a moment and decided to be honest. I did learn some things about the Chamber of Secrets before, he said. Not because of what just happened. I was already looking into this. Why? Hermione asked immediately. Ron and Harry leaned in. Because it involves Slytherin's legacy. Isn't anyone curious what he left behind? Hermione hesitated, then admitted she was curious, though clearly cautious. What happened 50 years ago? She asked. Ed's expression tightened. 50 years ago, the chamber was opened. A girl died in the girls' bathroom on the 3rd floor. She never left afterward. They all gasped. You mean Moaning Myrtle? Ron whispered. Ed nodded. Yes, the entrance to the chamber is believed to be in that very bathroom. He went on, voice low. I stationed ravens to watch there, trying to find whoever opened it. But they were attacked. The whole thing failed. It's more dangerous than I thought.